one Sunday, I said to my husband, he said, let's take the kids and go canoeing. And I said, no, let's take the kids and go get arrested.
I was white, I could go any place I wanted, not a problem. It was difficult to be black at that time and be free.
Take me on this roller coaster. I love it. Let's go. Look, oh, look, there's a Ferris wheel. Let's go. And it seemed so simple because it was right there on the road. And I got mad because he would just sort of grumble and he couldn't take me. And I didn't realize that he really actually couldn't take me because it was segregated and black people weren't allowed there.
I think it was there that the word racism took on meaning to me. That people actually could behave in that manner.
A couple of goons come up, one of them grabs my arms, the other one stands in front of me, goes boom, 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 smashing my glasses again, knocked me down, stomp on me.
So I turned, and when I turned too close to the crowd that was surrounding the picket line, and somebody hit me with a brick in the head.
When it came to civil rights, I just felt that you could not be, that you had to be a part of it. And as a Jew, you definitely had to be part of it.
I don't think it was a racial thing. I think it was, I didn't like people screwing with my park.
Back when streetcar lines were originally built, going back into the 1800s, at that period of time, most people worked 6 days a week. So on the seventh day, the transit companies didn't have too many people to transport. So they started creating what were referred to as traffic generators. Primarily, they were amusement parks. And back then, we didn't have the malls and various things like we have now. So the old United Railway and Electric Company built a place called Riverview Park down off Broning Highway where Western Electric had a good-sized plant, and it was very successful. And even while Riverview Park was open, the transit company also built another amusement park down below Sparrows Point known as Bay Shore Park. But in the meantime, we had other amusement parks that opened in and around Baltimore. One was Carlin's Park, which was located at what we call Park Circle, and the other was a little further out to the west, and that was known as Gwynn Oak Park. And I guess of the amusement parks in my lifetime that I visited the most would have been Gwynn Oak Park.
We lived on a corner of Harlem Avenue and Poplar Grove Street, and it was just a typical Baltimore City row home with the white marble steps out front that we had to scrub down every Saturday. And we moved there to Glendale Avenue, like I said, in the summer of 1955. It was the first time that I've ever lived in a house with grass and trees. It was like in the country, and it was a big deal. I mean, it wasn't like, you know, the city anymore. You didn't have a concrete backyard or, you know, no trees around. It was fun. We could climb a tree. We had to rake leaves, cut grass. It was a whole different lifestyle, and it was really fun. But the biggest thing was the stream behind our house. And one day I was walking along the Gwynn Falls stream down there, and I came across the entrance to Gwynn Oak Park, and it was like a playground. It was really unique. I've never seen anything like it before. I'm 10 years old, and all of a sudden I got all these big toys in my backyard. And I didn't know at that time exactly what effect it would have on my life. I mean, I spent from 1955 clear up to 1972 at the park. It was my second home. I was there pretty much every day, every weekend. The park was part of my life. Matter of fact, the park was my life.
It wasn't a Disneyland. It was part of my life. It was something that meant a lot to me. Naturally, being the electrician's son, I would sometimes be able to get on these rides without paying, and just they would put me on them, you know. But then we hit the Ferris wheel, which was a single stage Ferris wheel. right there towards the head of the park, which was a neat ride to ride too. It was an older one, but it was cool. And then naturally the Big Dipper up at the front edge, which was all made out of wood, Big Dipper. And when you rode it, it shook. You know, if you were skittish, you shouldn't have been on it. But it did roll, and it. I remember one day I must have rode it 10, 15 times.
We would go out on the old 32 streetcar line, and then you walk down to the park, and as soon as you got off the streetcar, even maybe before, you know, it was warm weather, you would hear the music from the Dixie Ballroom. They had loudspeakers outside, so it just permeated the neighborhood with music and the sound of fun. And you could go in, and it was free. There was no admission. You could just walk in and spend the day without spending a dime, just watching the people. And if you had a little money, you could go on a ride or buy, you know, something to eat and just spend the day there. And there were thousands of people, thousands. And it was just fun.
I loved it. I mean, it was an experience that we didn't have out in the county. All these amusement rides, and I loved the roller coaster. I loved all the wonderful rides. We wouldn't stay very long, but we enjoyed, you know, being out there.
I loved to go on the rides that went around, but my father would get sick on those rides, so he didn't go. So we had a maid, and she was black, but she could go to the amusement parks if she had a maid's uniform on. That's even worse. Black people couldn't go, but if they were in a maid's uniform, they could. That is even worse, I think. And, you know, even as a kid, because my parents weren't thinking that, they just wanted somebody to go on the rides with me that didn't puke. You know, and she would go. But we went. And I remembered that later. Of course, as a kid, I don't know that I even knew, you know, that black people weren't allowed to go. Because I didn't know black people then in Lutherville. And remembering that today, you think about that and think, this wasn't that long ago. 50 years ago, but still, that is more than 60 years. That's really shocking. That's worse than not being able to come at all.
When I was asked about going to Gwen Oak Park, I was really excited about going and riding on the Ferris wheel, and I had never been to an amusement park. So I was really excited about that. And I knew if I was going with Aunt Mabel, it would be fun times too, especially when I thought her children were going. But at some point when I found out why we were going, I didn't feel safe there. I didn't feel I could enjoy it as much. Growing up, as I said, people knew I was black. My family knew I was black. My friends knew I was black. So everywhere I went, I assumed I saw a black girl. So I thought everyone else did. And when I found out that black children, black people could not go to this park, I was afraid. We snuck into the park, go in, and I remember it was so clean and people were so friendly, and it was just crowded, congested, a lot of kids. The only place I saw that many kids was when we went to the beach. We went to the beach a lot, Fort Smallwood and Sandy Point, or at the swimming pool. So this was the only place I had been, but I'd never seen Ferris wheels other than on the parking lot in the neighborhood in Glen Burnie. They always had carnivals on the parking lot. So it was the first place that we went to that was an official theme park, as they call it now. So I remember being excited and just being fascinated by the ice cream and the cotton candy, the merry-go-round, and those are, I remember one ride that went around like cups, dishes, not too much. And I do remember that they also had, probably seemed huge then, but the roller coaster. So I thought that would be, those were really fun times. But when we went to do all those things, I don't know how much of it was what I sensed that my aunt was feeling uncomfortable about, or how much I thought about the people and the conversations about black people trying to get in the park, because I did hear those conversations. And my aunt and I kind of would give each other a little look, because we knew, and we wondered if any minute they would notice that we were some of those black people they were worried about. And it didn't seem like we stayed very long. It seemed like we stayed to accomplish that and leave. And to be honest with you, I felt relieved because I didn't feel, it no longer was a fun moment. It was no longer a time that should have been for me just to go have fun and be a little kid. It was a time that seemed like a responsibility, a time of fear. I couldn't wait for it to be over because I was afraid at any minute that someone would say, "There they are, get them."
I was the rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime. I learned many things. The most important thing that I learned in my life, and under those tragic circumstances, is that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problems. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, and the most tragic problem is silence.
I lived in Northwest Baltimore. In those days, it was an almost entirely Jewish neighborhood. My grandmother had come to America in 1906 from Poland. And one day when I was a kid, she came back. There was a line of stores on Park Heights Avenue, Lower Park Heights Avenue, just above Park Heights, just above Druid Hill Park, only a block or two above the park. There was a line of stores. And one of the stores was a kosher butcher. My mother didn't keep kosher, but the only place to get meat was at that kosher butcher store. There weren't supermarkets. So my grandmother came back from standing in line to buy meat at the kosher butcher. And she looked very strange. She was sort of half laughing and half crying. And I said to her, "Grandma, what's going on?" So she said, "I was standing in line at the butcher shop, and two of the women next to me in line were talking nasty about the Schwarzes." Not, that's Yiddish for the black folk, not exactly as bad as the N-word, but pretty close. And they were talking nasty about them. And I interrupted them. And I said to them, "You cannot talk that way. In Europe, they talk that way about us. And this is America, and you must not talk that way." So, for the family I grew up in, it was clear that being Jewish meant that nobody talked that way about anybody, about Jews, about black people, about anybody. Nobody talked that way, and nobody acted that way.
I'd grown up in a home where there were people in my living room who had numbers in their arms from the concentration camps, my cousins, the few who survived. I knew what those numbers meant. I'd seen pictures of people coming out of the camps. That meant, I knew they wiped out most of my family. And all those things combined, you know. My father was fairly conservative. He was not a crusader at all, but Pop was a good man. And he was the first doctor in Baltimore to integrate his waiting room, not because he believed in any segregation, he just believed in doing the right thing for his patients. He integrated his hospital, the Baltimore Iron Air Hospital, ended the colored ward because he refused to move his patient. His patient turned out was Henry Parks, and he refused to move him to a colored ward. So those things were just in my family, you know, and so, and my mother always used to say to us when we were kids, because she was Brit, and she was British, and she was, as I said, she was British, and she was a brave person and expected her kids to be brave. And she was fearless. She used to say to my brother and I, when we go out, if something was dangerous, to come home on your shield. She always believed that we should stand up.
I would start every Saturday with a carload of flyers and blanket every church, pool room, drugstore, hardware store, anywhere that people might go in on the weekend, you know, to draw them to the demonstrations. You know, back and forth across town, all of us would be giving out flyers, talking to people, and meeting in churches, and anywhere you could get two people together, we would meet to try to recruit them for the demonstrations. The youth, the seniors, anybody that we could get that could carry a picket sign or answer a telephone or help recruit anything. Then we had training of the demonstrators to make sure that they understood what nonviolence was, because if violence had broke out from the picket lines, it would have been, you know, it would really thrown us back, because people would have said, you know, look how they are acting. But with us being well-dressed, well-mannered, obeying was it 6 feet apart on the picket lines, you know, you really couldn't say it too much, you know. It wasn't that we were going out there banging people upside the head saying, you know, let us in. We're saying, look at us, we deserve to be in, you know. And the training was a simulation of the actual events that would happen on the picket line. You know, the screaming and the hollering, the cursing that the people would do. It was a very thorough training. So when a person went out there for the demonstration, they would be prepared what to expect. You know, nothing wouldn't happen that they didn't expect to happen.
When we spoke in the churches, many people listened to us. And they would ask us what could they do, and what, you know, we were able to get people to follow us. And we told them, go talk to your preacher, go talk to your rabbi, go talk to your leader, and get him to make a commitment to this. Because at that time, there were Jewish people and rabbis that stood out for it, but the rest of the clergy was, you know, tissing about it. No, it's not right, but, you know. So we asked them to put up or shut up.
The Jewish community, by and large, in those days, did not see the rabbinic pulpit as one where the leadership took social action. It was generally thought that the religious leaders would preach and cite examples of justice. Rabbi Lieberman Rabbi Morris Lieberman of the Baltimore Hebrew congregation began to do some pioneering in this, and he called together a lot of his young congregants. He thought the Jewish community ought to go beyond preaching about it.
He was very friendly with a minister named Marion Bascom, and people like that would come and speak at the temple. From time to time, he had visiting ministers, and in a lot of ways, he may have been before his time in that he spread his wings further than just our congregation. He was a man who felt that religion wasn't just something that you did in temple. He felt that it was sort of your moral values and the way you lived outside of temple as well as inside of temple. And so he started this, I don't know if it was called a civil rights, could have been called a civil rights part of the temple, and anybody who wanted to and was interested could be a part of it. It was a very important part of temple, and it kind of made it gave your religion real meaning. You weren't just going to services and singing or learning or whatever, but you were really acting out the values of what you were learning. And so we got very, very close to Rabbi Lieberman. He was really our sort of moral compass, if you will. And so he just got these ideas, and so did other rabbis. I'm not saying he was the only one in town, but he was the one that we were close to. And so when he got an idea, like maybe we should be doing something about Gwynn Oak, we all said, yay, that's it.
They began to make their presence felt in the restaurants, and there's a famous example where Rabbi Lieberman, Furman Templeton, who was African American, Rabbi Shaw of Temple Ohab Sholem, Rabbi Schusterman of Har Sinai, went to Miller Brothers, very popular downtown restaurant, and tried to get in, but with Furman Templeton there, who was a very prominent African American leader, they wouldn't let him in. And they made a scene right then and there. They went on television. It has to be said that not all the congregants were pleased with it. Some really thought, well, that's not really what the rabbinic position ought to be. They ought to stay on their pulpits. But in the case of these particular rabbis, there were 3 or 4 Reform rabbis and 2 or 3 conservative, from the conservative movement, Rabbi Goldman, Rabbi Schechter, I believe. And they put their bodies into this thing. They took it from the pulpit to the threshold, and made a point that had not been made in an organized way in the Jewish community before.
I remember going into the church, sitting in the pew in the church after the speeches were done, and they told us, now if you were going to go to the park to demonstrate, you had to go into another room. So we went into the other room, and then at the appointed time, we got on the buses and drove to Gwynn Oak. We got off the bus, and there was a lot of noise and screaming, and people were spitting at you and throwing water and at you from bottles. But no one was hurt, and no one was hit with anything that would hurt. There were police controlling the crowd. We were told that if you get off the bus and go into the park, then you will be automatically arrested because you're trespassing. I was scared. I didn't think I was going to be scared, but I remember being scared. You know, they were screaming, and you know, somehow when people's faces and they're screaming and angry, it's a little scary. And some people had things in their hands, even though we were told that we probably would be safe because there were plenty of police there. But they reminded us if we got off the bus, we were now trespassing, and that we would be arrested immediately, and we were. You know, we were told that as we got off the bus, the police were there to tell us that we had to get back on the bus and we were under arrest. And everybody was very orderly and did what they were told. It's just the mob was not orderly, but they had enough people there to keep them in control. So it wasn't scary for too long, because once you got back on the bus, you know, you had some metal between you and the crowd.
I read in the paper about the July 4th demonstrations, and I was interested in that. And I was a member of CORE, and I had taken part in a demonstration with them. And so when I learned that there was another demonstration on Sunday, I said to my husband, he said, let's take the kids and go canoeing. And I said, no, let's take the kids and go get arrested. And he was a sociologist and interested in, you know, you got to have research and know what's going on. And he said, I'm not sure I believe in these demonstrations. And I said, well, I'm not sure either. And while we decide, let's go get arrested. So he agreed. And so we drove to Gwynn Oak Park. We'd never been there before. And you could either demonstrate outside carrying a banner, and they had plenty of banners for people, or if you wanted to go in, you signed up, and of course we were a white couple, no problem, we could go in. So we were matched with a black couple, and so we started in. The minute we crossed the line, boundary line, the owner was there and said, "Arrest them," and police surrounded us. And they had just taken a busload to Pikesville Armory, where in the previous demonstration, I guess they'd filled the jails, and they knew there were going to be a lot of people, so they had it arranged. We were taken to the Pikesville Armory. Well, a bus had just gone off, so they were worried about us and the children. I mean, I have 3 children, Tom, 8, John, 6, and Steve, carried in my arms, was 5 months old. So we were put in a police car, and my sons were thrilled about riding in a police car, but they would have been more thrilled at riding in the bus with all the other people. But anyway, so we got to the Armory, and we sat on bleachers. It was about the middle of the afternoon, and finally, about the middle of the night, my husband and I called for fingerprints and mugshots. Well, I noticed that the families with children were the last ones to be processed, and I thought this was supposed to be punishment. Well, it wasn't, because that people were able to bring in food, and so my children, the center of a lot of attention, milkshakes, hot dogs, hamburgers, ice cream, and all that attention, and staying up until the middle of the night. What more could you ask for?
Folks came to the church to recruit. There was a bus that came by, and the minister cut the program short, and let a bunch of us onto a bus. Then we went out to the park, and guy who owned the park they used to read this trespass notice and asked you to leave. I never figured out how I got to the very front of the line, but there I was, and when I didn't leave, as others didn't, they snatched me up. I pretty much was the first person somehow that got snatched up and put in a paddy wagon with 10 to 15, maybe 20 feet from me were kind of a roped off, howling mob of white folks shouting obscenities and names.
There was so much that could have gone wrong, because you had racist people at that time that I'm almost certain, if they had had the ability and the power, they would have thrown bombs, they would have, it's just no telling. I wasn't certain that something wasn't going to happen, but there also was a fear that something could go wrong on either side, because you couldn't guarantee the conduct or the performance of everybody on the picket line. And you darn sure couldn't guarantee what that crowd was going to do, So it was like you were caught in the middle and hoping things would go the way you wanted them to go. Other than what did happen, but it didn't, and I'm glad that it didn't. But it was, you got a tight feeling, but you still had to do it. It's sort of like you got yourself in the corner, you couldn't turn back because the crowd was behind you. They were pushing you, had to do it, you just couldn't turn around and say, call this off. You couldn't live with yourself or walk out in the street again. It was, that type of thing. Yeah. But, yeah.
I remember the police, they were pretty scary. They were pretty mean. They were tough, carting people away, carrying people away, pulling people away, really disrespecting the young women and women who were being arrested by how they pulled them up and their skirts flying up, and they didn't care. They actually did it on purpose, I think, and all the rest. And the kind of hate-filled stares of the Price boys and their people. They always used to make it out like it was just business. But yeah, just business to keep it segregated. That was just the business.
I think that the demonstrations will affect
the change desired at Gwynn Oak Park. It is hoped, however, by Mr. Rudolph Jones and myself that the county will take action and pass a public accommodations measure.
We would have mock picket lines. We would actually have demonstrations. We would walk a picket line in the at Metropolitan United Methodist Church, for example. Reverend Frank Williams was pastor at that time, and we would use the church hall to actually put on a demonstration. We would have people who would shove other people to see if they understood that if someone shoves you, from a tactical point of view, you couldn't shove them back. You were not to hit back. You were not to strike back. Because if you were to strike back, you would defeat the purpose of the nonviolent protest, and that is to win friends, and understanding that it was the obligation of myself and others to try to mobilize the kind of police protection that would afford you an opportunity at least not to get beat to death in a situation where there might be a physical confrontation or where someone might call you a nigger or what have you. So yeah, we had folks make signs. We had marking pencils and so forth. So we would make the signs, the picket signs, and we would write down a listing of what the proper wording should be on the signs. And of course, no profane and abusive language. You were sure of that. But you had to think carefully about the wording on the signs, and you had to think about the spacing of the demonstrators. You had to think about if someone pours coffee on you or spits on you, you've got to absorb that, just have some paper towels or a handkerchief or something and wipe it off and keep stepping. And if you were injured, we'd get you an ambulance or we'd do what we had to do. We might shield you, and in the course of trying to shield you, we might get beat up. But we would not fight back for fear that a fight in and of itself, confrontation, a physical fight, would work in a way that was not in our best interest. The idea was to gain or garner sympathy from the masses, from the public at large, for folks who espoused and promoted nonviolence. So you wanted to gain the support of the public, even if members of the public were skeptical about the purpose for which you were fighting and advocating equality of opportunity. You still wanted to, and you felt that being pictured as being the receiving, on the receiving end of a physical attack would work to our advantage from a public relations point of view far, far better than getting into a fist fight.
They were expecting us, a bunch of us from Corps. So I walked up to the front gate, because they really hate me now. And they're all the guards are standing there, all the guys they brought in from the outside to pummel demonstrators, the owners standing there, they're standing there with their arms barred, and the cops are standing around. And they said, "Romer, you are not getting in here." And I said, "That's perfectly all right, because the rest of us are already in." And what happened was they all came up to greet me. The rest of the Corps people went around the back of the park, and they crossed a little stream there, and they came into the park from the back. And somebody screamed, "Oh my God, the niggers got in from the back." So all these people at the front gate turn around and they start running into the park to catch the niggers who got in the back. And so I stroll down the middle of the park. Oh, that's perfect. A couple of goons come up, one of them grabs my arms, other one stands in front of me, goes boom, 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 smashing my glasses again, knock me down, stomp on me, tear my coat, my shirt. I'm a bloody mess. They pick me up, they take me over to a Baltimore City cop who's standing there, a Baltimore County cop, throw me at his feet and say, "Here he is, arrest him."
The way this went on July 4th, it was like a very formalized ritual. We crossed the line, the police arrested us. So another group crossed the line, the police arrested them. It was just very formal, very boring. We have discovered there is a way into the park from the back. You have to cross a stream, and then you're actually in the park. And you can go to the merry-go-round. You can go to the Ferris wheel, straight there. So we're going to do it that way. That feels much more real to us. You want to join us? Well, I didn't know a soul except for them. I'd been in Baltimore for years, except to visit my parents. So I said, well, sure, okay. And I like the idea of being really in the park. So they take me to the back of the park, and I take my shoes off to cross the stream, and we start our way into the park. But what nobody had taken into account was, because of the July 4th demonstration, there had been these huge newspaper stories. And a lot of people who thought it was their park, white folks from Baltimore County, it was their park, and the county executive was Spiro Agnew, who later became Vice President of the United States. And he was defending the park and private property and the rights of the owners to make it white only if they wanted to. But now there were thousands of people, white folks, in the park who were prepared to defend it against these nasty integrators, right? Left-wingers, God knows what we were. They had a nasty name for us, which I won't repeat, even now, even 50 years later. So they saw us. There was a group of 7 or 8 of us, black and white, women and men, mostly student age and me. I was older than the others. And they were furious.
And we stopped, because I don't think any of us had seen that kind of hostility from so many people at one time.
So they started yelling at us, very nasty names, screaming at us. And then at least one of them, maybe more, started throwing stones at us.
One woman with a child hanging onto her skirt came up, called me a nigger lover, and threw a rock at my head.
I had just written this dissertation about race riots, and I knew what the whole process was like. And so they threw stones, they yelled, and then they got closer, and then they surrounded us, and they started pushing. And I knew that there was this kind of process. If you fell, then it was like you weren't human anymore if you were fallen on the ground, and they beat you up and possibly killed you.
It was a sea of hostility. I mean, I had encountered 1 or 2 people before, but this was an absolute sea of hostility. And people would just begin calling us all kinds of things and threatening all kinds of things. And then the police came and they arrested us. And I remember somebody said, well, she's bleeding and she should go to the hospital. And then there was a discussion about hospital or jail, and it was decided that I should go to the hospital. And when they put me in the car, I forget the fellow who was with me, but he was a black gentleman. And when they pulled out, they said, we have a black patient, which of course meant that I had to go to Johns Hopkins, because that was the only place where black patients would be accepted at that time. And they sewed me up, and they came back to take me to jail. And they were leading me out, and I remember the doctor said, no, you're not taking her. You're not taking her. And that was it.
They don't arrest anybody for throwing stones. They don't arrest anybody for assault. They arrested us for trespass. And they saved their lives by arresting us for trespass. And they took us away. The folks in the park backed off when the police came. And the police took us away. I remember we're singing, "We Shall Overcome." One of the verses says, "We are not afraid." So we sang that verse, "We are not afraid. We were very afraid.
I know I did a lot of interviews with them, the ministers, and they were all interesting, and it was a movement that had begun, and it was a big story. The Gwynn Oak story was a national event. People came, the networks were there. It was a huge event.
Dave, we did this for the simple reason that we are committed to the desegregation of the Gwynn Oak Park in 1963. Those whom we represent charged us to come here and to indicate that, and so we have no other alternative.
It is a recommendation of the Human Relations Commission that, number one, integration of Gwynn Oak Amusement Park take effect on July 26, 1963. 2, all demonstrations in and about the area cease immediately. 3, parties reserve the right to re-examine policy in the light of existing law and circumstances on January 1st, 1964. 4, any disputes under this agreement will be referred to the Human Relations Commission. Meanwhile, the Commission has unanimously recommended that all demonstrations cease until at 2 p.m. on Monday.
I believe we had a fruitful and certainly cooperative meeting here this afternoon. Based on what transpired, a statement has been prepared which was agreed to by Mr. Bassignani of the Lawrence Construction Company and by the Interdenominational Ministerial Alliance and also by the Civic Interest Group. Reverend Bascom has that statement available at this time.
Following a full discussion, all parties agreed that further steps be taken to remedy this racial imbalance. This is, the integration leaders expressed the hope that this would be done by Monday, August 26th. A progress report will be submitted to the Office of the Commission on Interracial Problems and Relations on Friday of this week.
What is the answer as to future demonstrations, Reverend Newbold? Well, it was agreed before our coming here, it was understood that if we did not receive an affirmative answer today in terms of desegregation, that peaceful, nonviolent, orderly, dignified demonstrations would be resumed.
And is that immediately?
I would say immediately, yes.
March on Washington will mark August 28, 1963 as a symbolic one to the cause of racial equality nationally. It is perhaps fitting and proper that this coincidentally was the date chosen for the integration of Gwynn Oak Park, and I hope the years will testify to the significance of this day to the cause of racial equality locally. We agree with Mr. Price's premise that Gwynn Oak Park could be a pilot project with a wonderful opportunity for success if this opportunity will only be grasped by the community. My family and I will be at Gwynn Oak Park on August 28th, and I'm confident that the citizens of Baltimore County will make this pilot project in human relations a resounding success.
I remember the summer when it was integrated, and there had been protests and arrests and all these things. I didn't know that at the time. I mean, I was a child. I didn't sort of know the context of it. All I knew was that I could go on the roller coaster and my father could take me on the roller coaster. And I do remember that we did get dressed up in a way that I think was a little dressy for a park. I think I wore a dress and my hair was beautifully combed with braids. And I do believe my father had on a suit, which you wouldn't wear to a park. But there was that sense when you were one of the first people that you want to make a great impression. And I do remember it was some kind of festival and they had food there and everyone was incredibly nice to us. But they did look at us. And I do remember asking my father, why are people staring at me and staring at us, and he said, well, it's because you're so pretty. And I do remember that, and that's such a thing that a father would say to a child. And we went on, used to have a double Ferris wheel, and we went on that. It was really high, but I really wanted to go on the roller coaster, and I do remember we went on there 4 times in a row, because it had been, you know, when you anticipate something, it had been such a long time of me seeing this thing I couldn't go on. And he took me on, and we would come off, and I said, let's go on again. Let's go on again. And he didn't balk. You know, a parent might say, you've had enough. We've been on there already. But in this case, he took me on 4 times, and it was fabulous. It was wonderful. He took me in my park, and I went back many times growing up here. Our school would go and things like that, but nothing ever made such an impression as that first time with my father taking me, knowing he could take me there. And it must have been so emotional to him to be able to do this thing. And as I said, when I became an adult, that's when it hit me. Segregation is a terrible thing in many ways. It's insidious. But in these little teeny things that are part of your life in so many ways that most people might never think of. Like who really has to go to an amusement park? But it affected relationships between husbands and wives and parents and children. And it was those daily indignities of saying you can't do this thing. And it has to have an effect on you. And it also, it has an effect on the society as a whole. I think that people don't realize that it wasn't that long ago. I mean, we have a black president and all of that, but you know, people are alive like me who, you know, my father's deceased now, but who can remember this and remember how far this country has come in a short period, but how far we have to go.
We knew that they were going to come in, and we had to accept it, and we did. And there was less fights. Problem was, by that time, the park got a bad reputation. The park got a reputation of being not the place to be and not the place to take your family, because there's going to be a fight of some sort or a riot or whatever. The families, they weren't bringing their kids there on Sunday anymore for picnics. They were going elsewhere, maybe to the Enchanted Forest or maybe out to Patapsco State Park or someplace. The money wasn't flowing. The corporations stopped bringing their picnics there. There were picnics there with 1,000 people every weekend. It was all gone. It's just unfortunate that it closed down. A lot of people don't know it, but you know, it was in foreclosure, and Agnes was the final straw. Agnes was what really destroyed the park. It took out 13 of the 31 rides that they had there and just totally destroyed the whole lower half. And there was no money to rebuild it. So once Agnes went through it, it was done. And York Ridge Federal bought it for $415,000, and then just got rid of all the rides and sold them out to different areas. And that was it. If the money wasn't there, the people weren't coming, they had to close. I see a memory lost. I see heartache. I see a teardrop. A lot of people's teardrops. It's something that was ripped out of your heart and hidden somewhere, and you look for it for the rest of your life, and you're never going to find it because it's gone. Nothing is left. It's a flat, level ground with some picnic tables, and this is what it's going to be forever. Gwynn Oak Park is not coming back.